Good afternoon, everyone. You're all most welcome here. Thank you very much for showing up today. It's the end of term. There's a sense of fatigue all over campus, and I'm sure that many people would have loved to be here, but were not able to for a number of reasons that I wouldn't like to start thinking about, is it being the end of term now. Anyway, it is my great pleasure and my honor to welcome His Excellency Monsieur Jean-Christophe Peaucelle, as our speaker this afternoon. The seminar is coming to an end. Next week will be simply a final discussion with the course students and anybody else who might wish to show up. But it has taken us so far across quite a variety of fields and approaches. From conjuring up notions of post-secular by philosophers with their ears attuned to the sky, working in normative registers of models, onto some rather more sanguine languages of anti-modernism, anti-secularism, discourses as well as practices that we have been able to talk about. And we have, of course, had the chance also to talk about the bloody turns of the Syrian civil war in the context of the overall overarching concept of this particular seminar. And now we are about to click back, as it were, into reality with ears rather closer to the ground and welcome a talk by a practitioner. Ambassador Peaucelle had served in the French diplomatic missions in Jerusalem, Tehran, and Istanbul. He had been ambassador in Qatar between 2011 and 2014. Qatar, as most of you would know, is a country where many very interesting things happen sotto voce, and many things that are of particular interest to the preoccupations of this particular seminar. His Excellency has since been an advisor on religious affairs in the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. With a profile such as this, who better to speak to us about France? The French model, after all, has been a secular paradigm par excellence, with a rich historical experience of complexity, uncertainty, negotiation, conflict, agreement, disagreement, institutional arrangements. It's a huge history and an extremely interesting and engaging one as well. It is also a paradigm which is strategically located. It is under attack, ideologically as well as practically, by advocates of US-style restricted kind of secularism, which is celebrated by the ruling party in Turkey, and by identitarian demands by a number of Muslim groups in France and elsewhere, pacifically as well as with an utmost use of violence, and by a renewed sensibility to religion and a sympathy for religion and indeed for superstition, due to a large extent to the Muslim challenge of Europe in the last 30 or 40 years. France is almost a laboratory of notions of secularism and for claims of counter or post-secularism. We heard last week a very interesting talk from Professor Akan about the way in which France and Turkey might be compared from the point of view of thinking about secularism or laicism across the 19th and 20th century. And our speaker today will address us about secularism in the 21st century. Your Excellency.
Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me in this university, of which we talk a lot in actuality, and it's my pleasure to bring my modest contribution to express the sympathy of my country to this institution. Thank you also for your presentation. First of all, I should ask one thing. How long time?
40 minutes.
40 minutes. I try 40 minutes. Okay.
If you really, it's whatever time you need to convey what you want to tell.
Okay, I'll try my best. And I beg your pardon because probably many things I'm going to tell you, you already know them, you already heard of them. Maybe I'll try to give you some light on how today we can think about laïcité in France in the 21st century. My intervention won't be limited to the 21st century because we have to understand the concept, we have to go back to the past. But I'm convinced that now in 2018, the concept of laïcité, if properly understood, is of great use for what I would call just social cohesion and civil peace. I do not pretend that France wants to export the concept. This would be stupid because I think that the French concept is very much linked to our national environment and background. But what I see in my work when I travel abroad is that, as it was said just a few minutes ago, the concept is largely misunderstood and harshly criticized, with two main sources of criticism. I would say the first one is globally what I call the Anglo-Saxon world, where laïcité is understood as something against religion. And the other pole of criticism is in the Islamic world, where laïcité is understood as something which is not compatible with Islam. And in fact, I'll try to discontrast these criticisms, because I think that they are based on misinterpretation of what it is. Another preliminary point is that we have a big difficulty in the translation of words. When I speak of laïcité in an Arab country, very often it is translated by atheism. So the misinterpretation is dramatic and huge. And there is even difficulty to make it understood in the Anglo-Saxon world, because I think that laïcité is different from secularism in the English or American comprehension. I draw your attention on the fact that in France we distinguish secularization, which is a sociological concept which applies to the society, and laïcité, which is a political and legal concept which applies to the state. You can have countries like the US, where you have a kind of laïcité because there is a separation between church and state, and a very religious society. And you can have the contrary, a political and legal system very clerical, very much in the hands of the religious institution, and where the society is highly secularized. I'm thinking about Iran. It's a surprise for many people, but I lived 4 years in Iran. I visited so many mosques as a tourist, and they were all empty. So, with your permission, although I am going to speak in English, I'll use the word laïcité to escape the question of translation. My first part will be historical. My second part will be dedicated to what laïcité is, which means also what it is not, and what it implies, including in some concrete examples, which are surprises for many people who would not think that laïcité allows this kind of dialogue and cooperation between the church and the state, or the state and the churches. And my third part would be, in my third part, I shall try to raise some questions about laïcité today in the French society in 2018. So let's go back to history, and I solicit indulgence from the historians in the room, because in 40 minutes, even 45, necessarily there will be some simplifications. Historically speaking, I would say that first that you cannot, it's impossible to understand laïcité if you forget that France is an old Christian country. More specifically, an old Catholic country. Régis Debray, who has a special gift for percutant formulas, says France is a pays catholique. Very briefly, remember 496, the baptism of King Clovis. He was baptized not only to enter Christianism, to adhere to Christianism, but he was baptized in the Catholic Church at a time when the European Christianity was very much divided by the consequences of the Arianist heresy. And his conversion, his baptism to the Catholic Church and not to the Arian heresy was a major fact for the Catholic institution, and that's why the Pope gave the name of elder daughter of the Church to France. And even though we are now laïc, I believe that culturally speaking, France is still very much la fille aînée de l'Église, the elder daughter of the Church. Go to France, travel in the country, you will see so many cities, streets with Christian names. Maybe people don't even know, they don't even think that the Saint-Étienne, for example, Saint-Étienne, Etienne is a name which is well known in Hungary. The city is known also for its football team. Saint-Étienne was the name of the first martyr of Christianity. This fact, which is a major fact, does not exclude that for centuries there was a struggle between the King of France and the Pope. The question was, like with other countries, the question was who is going to exert the spiritual power? Will the civil power control the spiritual power, or will the spiritual power will be independent from the political institution? The question of designation of bishops is maybe the best example of this fight. And secondly, the fact that we are an old Catholic country does not exclude that there were other communities even before the Revolution and modern times. There's been a Jewish community from very old times, from the Roman Empire, and Protestantism is very present in France, was more at a certain time. We had the religious wars between Catholics and Protestants in the 16th century, which was probably the origin of many things, including inside the Catholic Church and in the nation. It was the beginning of a reflection on how you can organize a peaceful coexistence between different communities. If France is the elder daughter of the Church, France is also the country of enlightenment, and this is the other France. The 18th century, with the philosophers, you remember Voltaire, I disagree with you, but I would die to make sure that you can say what you want to say. And this is also very much in the DNA of modern France. I profoundly believe that if you forget one of those two roots, you just have a half country. And so the question for the political authority in France, for the governments, is to assure a peaceful coexistence, not only between Catholic and Protestants, but also between believers and non-believers. And then we come to the French Revolution, under the control of historians, but I would say that the French Revolution is a dramatic misunderstanding. We pay the price for 2 centuries. The revolution is made against the monarchy and the king. But the king, the monarchy, is linked to the church. So the revolution very quickly becomes also a revolution against the church. So the church is against the revolution. And that's why the Catholic Church at that time condemns not only the French Revolution and its excesses, but also the very principle of freedom of conscience, the very principle of democracy. And I remember in 1980, I was 21 at that time, when Pope John Paul II made his first trip to France. He celebrated a mass in front of 1 million people, and under a heavy rain, I still remember. And he said, liberté, égalité, fraternité. In fact, these are Christian values. He was the first one to say that not only it was possible to support liberty, equality, and brotherhood, and to be a Christian, but that, in fact, was very coherent. So for all the 19th century, France was divided around this conflict. It was a civil war, maybe ideological civil war, but sometimes a bloody physical civil war. Remember what we call la terreur, the terror time during the French Revolution. Remember how around the turn between the 19th and 20th century, religious congregations were expelled from France, forbidden to teach and to keep their schools. And the history of the country was really structured to a large extent around this ideological conflict. The two camps being seen reciprocally as totally incompatible. In this context, where there was a secularization of thought, where you had the laws at the end of the 19th century to create the école laïque, the laïque schools. At the same time, you had a time of very strong revival of Catholicism in France. Some historians consider that in the second half of the 19th century, 1/3 or 40% of Catholic missionaries around the world were French. So those two trends were acting together. And finally, I'm going very, very quickly, I'm sorry, but I don't want to spend all the time on this question. We arrived to the famous law of 1905, the law of separation between the church and the state. In fact, the churches and the state. But practically speaking, the question was the separation between the Catholic Church and the state. I think that we can consider this law, 1 century and some later, as the peace treaty which brings an end to this ideological civil war I was talking about. But in 1905 it was not understood that way. It was understood that way if you read the parliamentary debate which took place in the National Assembly. It's fascinating. And I'm thinking that at that time we had very good politicians who were able to deliver very good speeches, well thought, well constructed. Broadly speaking, you had two options. One was a strong separation. It was promoted by Émile Combes. I think that this is close to what Turkey implemented a few years later. We separate, but we don't separate because we control. And we control because we don't like religion, which is something which survives from prehistoric times, from pre-rational times. And clearly this vision is anti-religious and wishes to control the religious sphere. You had another camp where you find Aristide Briand. Aristide Briand was not a practicing Catholic. He was rather anti-clerical also in his personal, intellectual structure. But he was a liberal, and he thought also that it would be ridiculous for the state to control all the details of religious life. The state is something else, and was, I think, profoundly right. So he oriented the debate around the idea of freedom of conscience that the Republic had to guarantee. But on the Catholic side, the people were so used to receive bad news and moves from the government that it was not understood that way. The Holy See condemned the law, broke down the diplomatic relations, even before the law, so even before our decision to put an end to the Concordat between France and the Holy See. And there was something in the law which is very important now and very positive for the Church, which is that all places of worship, all religious buildings which existed in 1905 became the property of municipalities. It was understood by the Catholic Church as something unacceptable. They felt they were stolen their property. And in fact, I can tell you that today there is not a single French Catholic bishop who does not thank God every day for this legal disposition, which means that the municipalities have to pay to take care of the churches built before the law. But it was not understood at that time. And finally, we had to wait for the First World War to get out of this conflict, impossible to solve conflict. Just simply because during the war, Catholics and others were together in the trenches and went through the same suffering. And finally they discovered that beyond their differences, religious differences, They all belong to the same family, which is a nation. And this discovery of being the sons of the same nation was very strong. And you have many stories. You have the story of a Jewish chaplain on the front, because there was a soldier who was dying, and the Catholic chaplain went to bring him across and give him the absolution. But the chaplain was killed. And so the Jewish chaplain went to the body of the Catholic priest, took the cross and brought the cross to the dying soldier. And many stories like that helped the people to discover that finally they had in common the belonging to the same society. It's in 1920, in this context, that France resumed diplomatic ties with the Holy See. It's in 1920, 21, 22 that the government solved its conflict with the Catholic Church about the Catholic associations, the government accepting that these associations would be established at the level of each diocese, which meant that the government was recognizing the religious authority of each bishop. And it's also in 1920 that my position was created in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, precisely to implement this new approach of relations between the government and religions. From this time, laïcité, which was defined by a law in which the principles are very briefly exposed and in which the word laïcité does not appear, laïcité was built, concretely speaking, step by step, by case law. And this is what I want now to try to explain in my second part. From the law, 1905 law, and from the case law and the practices, what is laïcité today in 2018? When I speak to a French audience, especially when there are teachers from the Ministry of Education, very secular, I tell them, laïcité is not une valeur de la République. It's not a value of the Republic. You know, in French political philosophy, this idea of valeur is very important. So the valeur de la République, the values of our country are, you know them, liberté, égalité, fraternité. I believe that laïcité is just a mean to implement these values in the field, very sensitive, of religious convictions. It does not mean that laïcité is not important. It's a legal principle, a fundamental legal principle, but it's not the objective, it's not the aim. It's a mean to get the aim. I developed this idea. The first article of the 1905 law says the Republic ensures freedom of conscience and guarantees freedom of worship. I draw your attention on the word guarantees. It's not recognizes. Guarantees. It means that the state has to provide not cult or worship, but conditions in which people can have a free access to worship. And this is the main principle, and I have to insist on that because when I speak with my American or British friends, they finally ignore this reality. It's largely our fault because the French debate is sometimes often focusing on what laïcité forbids. Well, it guarantees the freedom. This is the basic fact. Which freedom? Freedom of religion or belief? And I insist on belief also. I must insist on the fact that freedom of religion should benefit to believers and non-believers. Important in the United States now, the official speeches by President Trump or Vice President Pence ignore belief. In France, by the rise of the evangelical way of thinking. It's important. The question is to make living together believers and non-believers, and among believers, Jews, Christians, Muslims, and among Christians, Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox, and among believers, hard believers and soft believers, and interrogative believers and assertive believers, and all sensitivities. It's also the concept which is consecrated by international law. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18, will celebrate in 10 days from now, on the 10th of December, the 70th anniversary of this historical monument of international affairs. I invite you to go back to the text of this declaration. Freedom to believe or not to believe, and if you believe, freedom to change your religion. It's not nothing. Just consider many countries in the world where it's not possible because of the law or because of the social pressure. And so freedom to believe or not to believe, freedom to change your religion, and if you have a religion, freedom to practice and profess your religion alone or collectively, in private or in public, by worship, teaching, observing the rites. So the definition is a wide one, and it's technically impossible for us to have a conception of laïcité which will be against those treaties and covenants. The 1966 International Pact on Civil and Political Rights, the European Convention of Human Rights have the same definition. And in the domestic debate in France, I'm often in the position to draw the attention of my interlocutors, saying, oh, be careful. You cannot understand laïcité this way. It would be just against the principle of freedom of our constitution and international commitments. Which means that the rule is freedom, the exception is limitation of freedom, and then, like in any good democracy, the limitation is limited. The liberty, the freedom can be limited, but just for public order reasons, or limited by the freedom of somebody else, which has to be respected. Public order, that the limitation has to be necessary, proportionate to the goal, non-discriminatory, and under the control of an independent judge, an independent court. Maybe you heard about this very strange polemic which happened in France 2.5 years ago about the burkini, you know, the suit bath for Muslim women. In the south of France, in Côte d'Azur, several municipalities took municipal decisions to forbid this bath suit. And a few days after, the Council of State, the Conseil d'État, our Supreme Court in the administrative legal order, cancelled these decisions because there was no threat for public order. It was not proportionate. It was discriminatory. And so the principle is freedom. The exception is limitation, and this limitation is limited. The second point is equality. Is equality. And this point is more and more important as far as our societies are more diverse and plural. The question is to ensure equal rights to all citizens, which means that there cannot be any specific relation between the state and one religion. Even though you try to be as neutral as possible, if you have a special link, like we had in the 19th century with the Catholic Church, bishops were appointed by the state. You have a preference, and other communities will be second-rank communities, even though they have their own rights. So this principle, essential, is a principle of neutrality of the government, religious neutrality of the government. The government is not pro-religious, is not anti-religious. It's not anti-religious. It cannot, it's neutral. The government does not care if this minister is Catholic, Protestant, and in our spirit it's very much rooted. There are many ministers of the government of today. I don't know anything about their religious affiliation. Some spoke about it, but others, no. I cannot tell you. And there are consequences of this principle of neutrality. The first one is separation. If you have to be neutral, you have to be separated from any religious group. It means that the law of 1905 says, after professing and guaranteeing the freedom, says the state does not recognize any cult. So does not recognize. So many people in America say, it's terrible, in France you don't recognize religions? And I said, no, we don't recognize any. Which means that we recognize all. Which means that if getting out of this conference, I just receive an inspiration and create my new religion, I don't have to ask for a recognition of the government. I create my religion. And those who want among you will be my followers and disciples. And we don't ask, we don't have to ask to be recognized. We can just create an association to open a bank account, because I ask you some money for worship and other things. But the state does not interfere at all in this question. The state does not finance, does not fund any religion. If it begins to fund 1, 2, 3, there will be a fourth one which is not funded, and the equality will be broken. And we'll see that it does not mean that there are no religious, no financial links between the state and religion, but it's not directly to finance the cult. And it means also, and this is very important because it's one of the points which are the most criticized, that civil servants should be absolutely neutral in their service. If I'm a Catholic and I'm going to the Mass on Sunday, it's my private business. But as an ambassador, I'm not a Catholic ambassador. I'll tell you, in fact, I'm Catholic, and a Muslim friend of mine once said, would you accept to go to my students, they are Muslim students, they study Muslim theology, to tell about Catholic faith? I said, no. No, if you want me to talk about laïcité, okay, I'm ready. Maybe when I get retired, I'll be more free. But if you want somebody to talk about the Catholic faith, you ask the bishop, he will send you a priest or somebody entitled. So the neutrality of the civil servant is essential, and it goes up to the fact that the civil servant should do anything to avoid suspicion that is not neutral. That's why he cannot wear any religious sign, and it's the question of the Muslim scarf, or of the kippah, or the turban for Sikhs, and so on. And of course, if I spoke about liberté and égalité, you can guess which is the third term. Of course, fraternité comes, and brotherhood, but I'll say it in French because it's such a beautiful word in French, fraternité. The idea is that if the citizens are free to believe or not to believe, and to change their religion if they believe, to practice, and equal, and there is no preference of the state, so they can work together, live together, and work together, not side by side. Régis Debray, again, says cows live side by side. But human beings can live together, to bring together a common society, a common political society, which is called the nation. From this approach, which I want to stress, and I'm going to tell you why. When I make lectures abroad and I say laïcité, I can see in the faces of my audience, they are fed up with those French who always speak about laïcité. We are fed up. When I say liberté, égalité, fraternité, I can see light in the faces of my audience. They think, oh, that's France we like, France of liberté, égalité, fraternité. In fact, it's the same thing, but the approach and the understanding is different. So from this approach, some comments before some examples. First, very important, laïcité is not an opinion. Laïcité is not a belief. I don't like when people come to me and say, oh, you know, I'm very laïc. Stupid. Nonsense. Say the state is laïc, the republic is laïc. And you are a believer or anti-clerical, as you like. And if, as it is sometimes understood, laïcité becomes a religion of substitution, a kind of civil religion, like any religion, it produces is fundamentalism. And laïc fundamentalists do exist. I met them. So laïcité is not an opinion. It's written in one of the papers that we send. I don't know if the papers have been distributed. Laïcité is not an opinion. It's the freedom for anybody to have one. Second comment. Nothing in laïcité means hostility to religion. Hostility to religions would be, or to a religion, or to religions as a whole, should be against this neutrality of the state I was talking about. And nothing means ignoring religion. It's interesting that it's when we implemented the concept of laïcité that in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they felt the need to have a high civil servant specifically dedicated to religious affairs. And finally, it's much easier for me to speak with religious leaders from my point of view. I perfectly know who I am. I am a French diplomat serving a secular government. And my interlocutor, a bishop, an imam, knows who I am. And it's much easier to have a discussion when the roles of each one is clear. Third comment. From this neutrality of the state and this principle of freedom and equality, you can come to a triple liberty. The first one is that the state is freed from the church and religious influences. It does not mean that religious leaders cannot express their views. It does not mean that a Christian or Muslim or atheist citizen cannot vote against his own convictions. It means that the law is made by the parliament and not by any religious body. But on the other side, it means that religions are fully free to define themselves from a dogmatic point of view and to organize themselves from a canonic legal point of view. I'll take an example. Gender equality is now written in the French Constitution. The Catholic Church does not admit women to priesthood. The two questions, the two spheres are separated and independent. Imagine that a lady wants to be a priest. She goes to the Catholic bishop, says, I want to enter the seminar. The bishop will tell him, my poor lady, I'm sorry, but I cannot admit a woman to priesthood. And then she goes to the court, to the French court, asking for the judge to force the bishop to admit her. The judge would say, I'm not competent because the principle of laïcité does not allow me to define and to exert an influence on the content of the faith. Another example, 2 weeks ago, a former bishop, a retired bishop, Catholic, was condemned, sentenced by a court because he did not denounce a priest who committed sexual abuse to a minor. And the court tried to know whether this bishop had been informed by a public way or in the secret of confession. And the bishop had received a letter from a victim, from a former victim. Nothing to do with the secret of confession. So the court considered that he should have denounced the priest, and he was condemned. Which means that if he had been informed in the secret of confession, the court would have recognized this secret. And third freedom is the freedom of the believer. The believer is free from the church. In the public order of the country, you cannot accept that a church would lock down somebody in a house because he's not a good believer or she's not a good believer, or obliged, let's be very concrete, oblige a Muslim girl to wear the scarf. She does not want. The state has to protect this girl from the pressure of religion. But the state will not say that wearing the scarf is not Muslim, that it's not compulsory, that we read the Quran and we did not find any obligation. It's not the business of the state. The business of the state will be just to protect this lady which will be threatened or under pressure. It's not a theoretical question. In 2004, the parliament passed a law, which is very criticized in many countries, which prohibits religious signs inside public schools, not universities, not private schools. This law, I think we made a mistake because we presented the law as a law for laïcité. In fact, it's a law against laïcité. It's an exception to laïcité, because what laïcité would mean, it means neutrality of public civil servants. So neutrality of the teacher, but not the students. But what happened in that time, at the end of the 90s, is that in many places in France, you had young girls, Muslim girls, who were threatened in their neighborhood because they were not wearing the scarf. And it's because we wanted to protect the liberty, independence of these girls that this law was passed. It's not to say we don't want to see any religious sign, but there was a context in which there were unacceptable pressure, which, by the way, illustrate what I was telling you before, that freedom is more important than laïcité. Freedom is the aim. Laïcité is a way. Final comment. I told you that it does not mean ignorance and even less hostility to religions. It can mean cooperation. I'll give you some examples. And generally, many people are surprised when I give these examples. I told you about the property of worship places. In my village in Normandy, 120 inhabitants, the budget of the municipality is limited. The main budget is to take care of the church, because it's an old church from the Middle Ages, and this is an enormous support to religious communities. Enormous. And I can tell you that if the churches were all the property of the dioceses, they would be bankrupt. Another example, security of worship places. After the terrorist attacks in Paris, Charlie Hebdo and the Bataclan, you remember, there was a fear of Islamophobic gestures. And so the Ministry of Interior implemented a plan for the protection of worship places. You have something like 4,000 policemen who are dedicated to this purpose. The majority of the worship places under the protection of police are Muslim. But they are not the only ones. The Jewish worship places are also protected, and I can tell you the parish church in Paris close to my house on the Easter Mass or the Christmas Mass is under the protection of the police. What we call les aumôneries, chaplainship. Interesting, there is a public service of cult in specific conditions. Normally, there should not be separation. So it means that if you want to go to the Mass on Sunday, if you want to go to the synagogue on Shabbat, if you want to go to the mosque for the Friday prayer, it's your business, it's your choice. But if you are in a position where you cannot, because you are a prisoner, because you are a soldier, and you cannot get out of the barracks, or your regiment is in Afghanistan or in Sahel, or if you are sick and in a hospital and you cannot move, Article 1 of the law, the Republic guarantees freedom of worship, so the Republic brings religious services to the people. And you have chaplains paid by the government in the French army, in the French prisons, in the French hospitals, and you have every Sunday on France 2, which is the public TV channel, all the Sunday morning is dedicated to religious programs. Not programs about religion, not a documentary about the beginning of Islam. No, religious services. So people who cannot go to the mass can watch on the French public TV channel the Sunday Mass. Regarding education, Catholic schools teach about 20% of pupils till the baccalaureate, and 99% of them signed a contract with the government, which means that on one side they respect the rules of the Minister of Education and the curriculum. On the other side, the teachers are paid by the government. The teachers of Catholic schools are paid by the government. Another exception, Alsace and Moselle. You may know that in Alsace and Moselle, the 1905 law does not apply, because when it was voted, those three departments were under German occupation, and when they came back to France after the First World War, the population was very attached to this situation where the Concordat of 1802 was still valid. So the French Parliament voted a law saying that the 1905 law would not apply to these departments, which means that the Archbishop of Strasbourg is appointed by Monsieur Macron. In the old fashion. Of course, Mr. Macron will not appoint me. He will appoint somebody that the Pope wants to appoint. But the procedure is that he is appointed by the President. And after that, the Pope gives, je sais pas comment on dit, une bulle en anglais. A papal law, which says, I recognize this bishop appointed by my friend Emmanuel Macron as the canonic bishop of Strasbourg. And I could give you much more examples. I don't want to lose too much time, but it shows that laïcité is something much more complex and pragmatic than what people usually do believe. Now, in the 21st century, and we are in the 21st century, what are the challenges for our laicity? I would like to say the same ones as 1 century ago, because we still have to ensure civil peace, social cohesion in a country which is more and more diversified in its population. So just a few points. Islam. Islam in France is now about 10% of the population, 5 to 6 million. I cannot be more precise because of laïcité, we do not practice religious statistics. So it's an evaluation, but I think that it's a reasonable evaluation. So many people say that it's impossible that Islam would be compatible with laïcité, And the proof is that there is this horrible fact of radicalization and terrorism. Personally, I don't see why, I don't see, theoretically speaking, I don't see why it would be impossible. So people tell me because Islam pretends to be not only a religious but also a political project. I say, okay. At the same time, I know that there are in Muslim countries today a very strong aspiration of a good part of the population for a kind of secularism. And also I remember that in the Catholic Church, the Church pretended to be a political power for centuries. It's not, I think, according to the Gospel, but as soon as the Church was protected by the Roman Emperor, it became a political power. So this fact is now finished in its old manner, so why not for Islam? Second point, radicalization. I'll give you an example which is with figures. Figures, please don't take these figures as scientific ones, because it's impossible to give an accurate figure. Imagine that among 5 million Muslims in France, you have 50,000 radicalized people. It's huge. And 50,000 potential terrorists or extremists, it's a big danger for the society, but it's only 1% of the population, 1% of the Muslim community. And every day I meet Muslims who are just normal citizens, ordinary citizens. Then they think secular, even though they are practicing Muslims. But there is a fact, which is that Islam is a young religion, not in itself, but in the French landscape, religious landscape, which means that compared to other communities, Catholic, Protestant, Jews, Islam does not have its own institutions. There is no school, no seminar, no Muslim seminar in France. It's largely a community which comes from immigration, which means that they have the social problems connected to immigration, and they are probably less rich than other communities. And they have no building built prior to 1905. So all the mosques are the properties of the community, which has to pay for the construction and for the taking care of. It's not an inequality of status, it's just a question of fact. But this complicates the integration of the community. Another challenge is that we still have the same debate than 1 century ago. We still have the two conceptions of laïcité. I think that there is only one which is operational and compatible with the principles of human rights and our international commitments. But in the mindset of the people, many people still think laïcité in another way. They tell you, I am very laïc. They tell you, you do what you like, but in your private sphere. Remember, 1948, Universal Declaration, alone or collectively, privately or publicly. So when I hear French politicians saying, religion is a private matter, I agree, in the sense that religion is a matter for the conscience of each person. But it should be limited to private sphere. I disagree. What is private is your choice, as you or you, to believe or not to believe, and how to believe. if you believe, you should have the right to express it publicly. And our debate is very often biased. It's biased by all the survivors of the anti-clericalism of yesterday. If you are interested in the French politics, maybe you could recognize somebody like Jean-Luc Mélenchon in this trend. But you have also a growing understanding of laïcité, very strict, very rigorist, which is just something to hide Islamophobia. And we have to be very careful when we have debates, including in the government, about Islam. And probably at the beginning of next year, President Macron will announce some measures to integrate Muslims into the society. And I always repeat in our preparatory works, be careful. You should always wonder, what I'm thinking about for Islam could it be implemented for Jews, for Catholics? Practical example, you have travel agencies which propose contracts for the Hajj, for the pilgrimage in Mecca. Many of them are unclear, prices are not transparent. So it's a question of, regulation of an economic sector. Okay, but if you say, I want to regulate travel agencies for the Hajj, there is a problem, because you are not thinking about regulating travel agencies for the pilgrimage to Lourdes. So either there is something to do to ensure that travel agencies are more transparent as a whole, or don't imagine something which is limited to one religion. And I'll finish there. I think that the biggest challenge for our society and our understanding of laïcité is about religious illiteracy. The French society lost its religious culture. It's independent from faith. I'm not talking about faith, which is linked to the decline of faith, the decline of the rate of religious practice is linked to secularization. Okay, people are free to believe or not to believe. But I consider it dramatic how much the youth in our country, and even my generation, lost their knowledge about religions, including the ones, and the one which was at the heart of our history. I'll give you an example. A bishop, Catholic bishop, is a friend of mine. He was in a train some weeks ago in France, and there was in front of him, there was a lady with her son, maybe 10-year-old. Nice boy, quiet, polite. Bonjour, monsieur. And he told his mother, he said, Mom, look at the man. He has a badge with the swimming man. It's horrible. It's horrible. It's not a question of blasphemy, the question of, but it's terrible. How can this boy go and visit the Louvre? How can he understand, read and understand Pascal or even Maupassant? And so I once said in a meeting in the ministry, we were thinking about what we should do after Charlie Hebdo and all this. And I said, our society did in 50 years what Daesh did in half an hour in the Mosul Museum. You remember when Daesh destroyed the museum? Of course, my comparison was a little bit shocking, but I can tell you that after that, people stopped sleeping in the meeting. But I think it's a big problem, because if we want to ensure, in the spirit of laïcité, if we want to ensure the peaceful coexistence of all beliefs, which supposes that you have respect for all beliefs, and that whatever your belief, including non-belief, you respect beliefs of other people, you have to know about that. Laïcité wears a need for interfaith and interreligious dialogue, including with non-believers. But how can you have a dialogue if you don't know anything about yourself, about your cultural references? And this is something we work a lot in France. Once again, I'm going to quote Régis Debray. He wrote a report in 2002 after the 9/11 tragedy, and Régis Debray has a very laïc approach. He's not speaking on behalf of any religious community, but he's very much in favor of reinforcing secular teaching on what we call the religious facts, religious realities at school. So that it's a pity if a young boy or girl goes in front of Notre Dame de Paris and does not understand what it means. I mean, it's not a question of religion, it's so beautiful. The monument is so beautiful. It's a pity if he's not able to enjoy it. So this is a big challenge, because the teachers are reluctant. The teachers are reluctant because themselves they lack the basic religious literacy for that. They are afraid also to be contested. In some cases it's difficult, you know, when you have some young Muslim students in some places where there is the temptation of radicalization active, and you say, you begin to talk about Islam, and you have the boy, 12, 13, 14 years, no, it's not true, it's not that, and you have no right to say this because you are a lady or because you are not Muslim. A friend of mine is a teacher. He told me that in his class he had been criticized because he was talking about the Quran, and one student told him, it's a blasphemy, you are a Christian, you are not Muslim, so you have no right to touch the Quran. So, I mean, this anecdote both illustrates the difficulty and the need of this kind of cultural recovery. So maybe I have been too long, I'm sorry, but to conclude, I really much believe that the principle of laïcité is still very operational in our societies. And I always say when talking to foreigners that does not mean that it has to be reproduced as such in any context. But I believe that the concepts, the values of liberté, égalité, fraternité are really universal, that the need to organize peaceful coexistence between believers and believers, this need is universal, and that the necessity of religious neutrality of the state is also universal. And so I think that it remains a useful concept. Thank you.